Festive greetings! I am Herbert Erpaderp, and it's Christmas, and so here's the traditional Christmas Lee.
That's not a tradition, you've just made that up because you think you're funny.
Quiet you, some of that coal on the back is probably for you. Anyway, I'm going to show you how I painted this Hasegawa M3 Lee into a very sensible and festive holiday tank. The build video for this went up the other day, but I'll put a link below anyway. Okay, enough of that, time to paint. I start by priming the model in Ammo by MIG one-shot brown oxide primer. I do often use black as a primer, but I figured this would make it a little bit easier to apply the base coat, which obviously comes next. For this I used Vallejo Model Air Scarlet Red. Model Air is nice because it's already thin enough to go through the airbrush, hence the name. Though that doesn't mean you can't thin it if you need to, or if you just want to. I did a few coats of this to get a good strong solid red, though fewer than I would have had to do with a black primer. As you can see, it ends up being very red, which is exactly what I want. If I didn't, I would have used a different colour, I guess. Anyway, next it's time for a highlight. I dry brushed on a mix of roughly 3 parts Vallejo Model Colour Scarlet to 1 part Model Colour Pink. I used Model Colour instead of Model Air here because it's a thicker paint, and therefore better for dry brushing. I felt like the colour wasn't quite light enough, so I add a single drop of Model Air White, which as I mention is thin, but a single drop in relation to the rest of the paint here isn't going to thin it so much that it'll make a real difference. It still works well for dry brushing. As you can see, I'm just applying this more or less all over the model, focusing on edges and raised details, just to make them stand out a bit. It's already making the tank look a bit less like a plastic toy. Even though it is a kind of toy-like red, I'm not after a toy-like paint scheme here. Next, I take some Model Colour Uniform Green, which is obviously thinned enough to go through the airbrush, and using said airbrush, I apply a soft edge camo pattern. This is more or less random, and to make sure it matches with the turret, I've sat that in place, and had to hold it there to stop the airbrush from blowing it off. This is pretty simple. I go fairly slowly and carefully, with a slightly lower than usual air pressure, to avoid making the green parts too big. That said, it's not a perfect coverage, and there are a couple of bits where the red might show through, like on some of the rivets where I only sprayed them green from one side. Not really worried about that though. If anything, it might make it look like a field-applied camo or something like that, which I imagine a Christmas Lee would have if it were a real thing. I did consider adding some white camo as well, but I came to the conclusion that it would look a bit too busy, so I didn't do that. The next thing I did was to apply a coat of Army Paint a light tone, which was thinned roughly 50-50 with water. I just kind of slop this all over the model. It'll naturally want to gather itself in corners and gaps and such, but I don't want it to pool up too heavily in any one spot. This will slightly change the way the underlying colours look, and give a kind of dirty appearance, slightly darkening any gaps and recesses. Next, I apply chipping. I used the Ammo chipping colour here with a piece of sponge I got from the dollar store. Normally I would use packing foam from a Flames of War blister or something similar, but art-specific sponges work just as well. This is pretty much the same as the sponge chipping I normally do. In fact, it's exactly the same. Apply the colour to the sponge, remove most of it, a bit like dry brushing, and then dab it on in an up and down motion. Make sure not to drag this across the model or it's just going to look like a weird mess of paint and not chips. I try not to go too heavily with it, and in this case, I think I managed that well. A Christmas Lee probably shouldn't be too beaten up. Next, why not paint the metal tools? Model Colour Gunmetal seemed like a good choice for this. It's a bit shinier than I would usually like the tools on my tanks to be, and it will be darkened down a bit, but I feel like in this case, a bit of shiny silvery colour isn't out of place. Obviously I'm being pretty careful here, because it's much less work to go slowly and carefully than it is to have to go back and make corrections. Of course, that doesn't mean that you can't fix things later if you do make a mistake, and there's nothing wrong with a touch-up here and there where needed. Don't forget the tools at the front of the hull, whatever they are. They're probably metal too. An axe and shovel seem like they would have wooden handles, so I paint those with Model Colour Beige Brown, which seems like a nice woody colour to me. This is applied in pretty much the same way as the metal colour, slowly and carefully. I paint the tracks next because why not? I used Model Air German Grey here, and while I only really want this on the rubber track pads, and on the inside where the road wheels roll, I'm not especially worried if I get it on the guide horns or the outside of the track. which is fortunate because I more or less completely painted those all grey. I could have done the tyres of the road wheels with the same colour, but I figured using Ammo by MIG rubber tyres would add some colour variation and interest, so why not? I apply this all around the tyres.
Thanks, Captain Obvious!
There should be a slight rim around the inside, but because it's easier to just paint over it, I do that. We can always fix it later. It might not be too visible, but I also tried to carefully get the tiny bit of tyre that's just visible between the two suspension arm parts. It's probably more convincing to have some grey in there than bright red or green. I think the difference in colour between the tyres and tracks adds a little bit of interest. I figure maybe a light dry brushing with the Ammo rubber tyres on the treads couldn't hurt. It's very subtle and maybe a little bit redundant. Oh well, no harm done. Now to correct those rims. On the red areas, I used model colour Scarlet and carefully painted around the edge of the inner tyre. The way I do this is to remove some of the paint from the brush so it doesn't just go everywhere, and I hold the brush in such a way that it's at an angle to the edge, if that makes sense. Hopefully you can see what I mean. The model doesn't have raised rim detail here, so you can't use that to guide the paint. The main thing is to go slowly and carefully. It's pretty much the same thing for the green wheels, except instead of red I use the same green I base coated them with, which is model colour uniform green. It's a bit less bright and stands out less than the red, so you might like to use a slightly lighter green if you're going to do this yourself. For me, I think it's fine, and it is visible there, it just doesn't quite pop as much as the red does. Next, I paint the metal parts of the tracks. Here I've used Ammo by MIG rust tracks because, well, that seemed like the sensible thing to do, and you know me, I'm all about sensible things. This is pretty straightforward. I'm just painting the outside linky bits of the tracks and the guide horns. Obviously I'm trying to avoid getting this on any other parts of the tank, and it is a little bit fiddly to do so. Don't forget to do this on the outside of the tracks as well. As I mentioned earlier, I feel like it's a good idea to dull down the metal tools. I've done this with undiluted Army Painter Dark Tone. I also applied this to the grille on the engine deck because why not? You can't stop me, I've already done it. This darkens the tools a little bit, and if you do want them darker, you can always add more. It also runs down the side and around the edges of the tools, creating a sort of shadow. I also add spots of this to the ends of the gun barrels in an attempt to make them look a bit more realistic. It's not perfect, but it does the trick. I then thinned out the dark tone roughly 1 part dark tone to 2 parts water, maybe a tiny bit less water, and applied it to the tracks and road wheels. This is mainly to darken down the rust colour, but it also adds some shadow and depth to these areas, as well as a slight colour variation. I then applied Army Painter Soft Tone to the 2 wooden handles on the engine deck. This is simple, but it should add a bit of interest to them. I didn't want to do too much to these because I wasn't sure if I was going to put anything on the engine deck or not. Turns out I was. I didn't add these parts when I was building the tank, mostly because they don't come with the kit and I was too lazy to find them. I have this box for coal, which I think is a Pico model railway item. I've primed it with the same primer as the tank, and I'm going to use that as the base colour as well. I dry brush it with model colour Beige Brown. It's kind of rough, but I feel like that's more of a positive than a negative here. Because this is going to hold coal, I figure it should be pretty dirty, so I give it a good dry brushing with black Stynylrez Res primer, because the only other black I have is Model Air, and this works a bit better for dry brushing, and has a more matte appearance. I am mostly applying this around the top of the box, and it looks pretty dirty. I then brush the black on the inside and around the top of the box. I also figured a couple of crates painted to look like gifts would be in order. Not everybody is bad and deserves coal, I guess. I don't suppose the colours really matter here, but I did 2 with model colour Prussian Blue, and 1 in model colour Purple. To represent ribbons, I painted the bracing things on the top of the box, and because the bracings on the side don't line up, I just painted the colours down the side of the box. Works good enough for me. The colours I've used were model colour Magenta, the same purple I did one of the boxes in, and model colour Sky Blue. I chose these colours mostly because they would stand out from the tank, and also because they're bright and kind of festive. I glued the boxes onto the back of the Christmas Lee, applied a coat of Ammo Ultra Matte Lucky Varnish, and then, because I thought it would be funny, I added a couple of gold star stickers. They look a bit cheesy, but that's pretty much keeping with the theme, isn't it? As a finishing touch, I added coal to the coal box for all the bad little boys and girls. I haven't glued the coal in because I couldn't find my PVA glue, but eventually that'll be done. And that's the very sensible Christmas Lee completed. Very festive. Very funny. Get it? It sounds a bit like Christmas tree, but it's not a tree. It's a Lee. Ha ha ha!
You're not funny, Herbert. I hate you.
You're just jealous of how hilarious I am. I'm pretty happy with how this has turned out. I wasn't quite sure it would work, and I'm still not sure if I should have added some white to the camo pattern. Oh well, too late to go back now. I did also consider adding some chains, either painted white or gold-like tinsel and draped around the hull, but when I held the chain up against the model, I thought it looked a bit too silly. Just a bit too cluttered, really. Those might be ideas for the future if I do another Christmas tank. I probably won't though. I guess if I was into Christmas enough to have a Christmas tree, I could use this as a decoration. That would be cool. Better than most regular Christmas tree decorations in my opinion. Anyway, I rather enjoyed my time painting this. I do enjoy painting silly things if you didn't already know that. I don't know if there's much that you could apply to your own modelling in this video, unless you feel like painting your own Christmas Lee, but maybe there's an idea or two that you could use. And if you do, for some reason, want to do this yourself, there's a list of the colours I've used in the description below. I hope this paint job brings you a little bit of amusement. And even if it doesn't, it amuses me, and that's what counts. I know there's going to be some people who don't understand doing things for fun, who will fill their britches that something hasn't been painted realistically, and they're probably going to get coal for Christmas. For everybody else, I hope you have an excellent and safe holiday time. Even if you don't celebrate Christmas or anything like that, you can still enjoy holiday times. I know for a lot of the world it's going to be different this year, but I do still hope it's a good time for you. After the 600 months of 2020, I feel like we all deserve a good time. Anyway, Christmas stuff aside, I want to let everybody who watches my videos know that I appreciate them. Thank you very much. And an extra thank you to my patrons, the good folks who watch my streams over on Twitch, and all of the community in Discord. Continue being awesome, and let's hope that 2021 is a much better year. If you've built any holiday-themed models and you would like to share, why not head over to said Discord server and post some pictures. We'd love to see them, or if not holiday-themed, any other cool things you've made. That would be nice too. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to post those in the comments section below. And if you've not done so already, why not subscribe, follow, ring the bell, become a patron, or maybe just come say hi on Discord or Twitch when I'm live. Links to all of my things are in the description below, and as always, I shall return soon. So until then, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.